You are listening to the Mountainside Podcast, and our guest for this episode is Lisa Thompson. She has summited some of the most dangerous mountains in the world, including being the second U.S. woman to summit the infamous K2. But above all that, and all of Lisa's accomplishments, one of the biggest ones that stood out in today's conversation is her being a cancer survivor and not losing sight of what she wanted to achieve in her life while battling cancer. Lisa is a true inspiration. I really enjoyed our conversation virtually today, and I hope that you enjoy the podcast. Good morning, Lisa. Thank you for joining me. I appreciate you joining us virtually. Where are you at currently?
So right now, I live in Seattle, but right now I'm in a little mountain town where my family lives in north central Washington, which is called Winthrop. So it's snowy and cold up here, which is just fine with me. I love it.
Yeah, we are definitely getting that weather here in Colorado too. I'm at about 7,000 feet, so the snow
I
hasn't
love
gone
it.
away for the last month, which is awesome.
Yes, it's awesome. I agree.
Definitely need it. Well, congratulations on the newly published book. I really appreciate you reaching out to us and sending me this copy. I had no idea what I was getting into when I started reading it, and doing a little bit of homework on you and then having this. I'm so glad that you reached out to us. Your story is amazing. I encourage anybody to go and pick this up if you're into mountaineering, if you're into climbing 14ers, or if you want to take it to that next level like you've done, doing the 7 summits. And not only that, you don't even have to be into mountaineering. Just what you went through personally battling cancer while you were planning some of these trips is
Mhm.
an inspiration in itself, and just keeping your laser focus, it seemed like, on your goals while all that was happening. I guess where do we start with this, Lisa? Where do you want to start?
Well, often people want to know how a girl who grew up in the Midwest, in the middle of Illinois, in the middle of the US, where it's flat, got into climbing. And so, if you're into finding elevation already, if you've read at least the beginning chapters, you know part of that story. I like to tell people that my entrance into climbing started out of spite. I in my late 20s was the only woman at a pretty conservative healthcare company in Seattle. That's where I worked, and the guys in my office who were good guys, nothing against them at all. But, in Seattle, like in Colorado, part of the culture is climbing and being in the mountains. I didn't grow up that way at all. But when I got to the office, my peers would regularly go climbing on the weekends in the Cascade Mountains near Seattle. And they would come back to the office on Monday morning and they would just have these amazing stories about, being on a rope team and crossing crevasses and walking through icy rivers. And I did not know or care about any of that stuff. But what I saw in those conversations was this really tight knit group of people who had a really strong bond and a lot of camaraderie. And I, in the office, always felt like the odd person out. And I thought, wow, if I could start climbing, then maybe they would see me as capable and maybe I would be a part of their group then. And I didn't at the time, I didn't have the courage or the voice to say, like, raise my hand and say, that sounds like it's so much fun. Can I come with you? Instead, I just got frustrated by it and I decided I would go climbing on my own. I had no idea what that meant. And that started with just hikes in the Cascades. And eventually, the first big mountain I attempted and climbed was Mount Rainier, which is the highest point in Washington.
Yeah, I thought one of the things that I found interesting in this is you started this not at a young age, right? Like, you're not that you're old by any means, but most people start this sort of adventure. Like, I grew up in Colorado, grew up in the mountains. I was a very outdoor family. We didn't grow up with a lot of money, so like our family vacations were camp trips or backpack trips or just being outside, going to the river, outdoor activities.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then growing up here as well was like playing in the mountains. So I was just kind of integrated to that. And then at
Yep.
18 or 19, I kind of did the opposite thing. Like I wanted to get as far away from that as possible. So I moved to the beach and, decided I
Wow.
wanted to surf and got a career in rock and roll and did all this crazy stuff. Got to travel the world, see some amazing spots. But then full circle, I came right back to here because I
Yeah.
realized how much nature has always had some sort of connection to me. Um, Growing up here, it was really me having kids and deciding how do I want them to grow up. And I thought,
Yeah.
it made me really appreciate it at that point. But did you grow up like going on camp trips or being in the outdoors at all? It seemed like,
No.
from what I read from the book, you kind of started this in your mid 30s, maybe, right
True.
around 40. And most people
Yes.
are kind of set in their ways, they're set in their career, they have their habits, and they don't really get outside of those, I don't think, to go find adventure, the average person.
Yeah, I think that's totally true. And I didn't, my family took, our vacations were probably similar to yours. We took a road trip and like went to Chicago for the day, or like I remember going to a zoo in Indiana. Like those, we didn't have money to take elaborate vacations either. And my parents are not very outdoorsy. So they didn't do what your parents did and like think about, oh, this would be a cheap family vacation if we went camping. I think the first time I slept in a tent was probably I was in high school, and it was probably, to be honest, like a drunken outing with friends. And that was like part of the deal was we slept in tents, and that was how we got away from our parents.
Right.
So at that point in my life, I did not feel a big like draw to the mountains. I did though at a very young age really connect with nature. And it was, in a tumultuous family, that was where I found peace and solace. And growing up in Illinois, that often meant like walking through cornfields or like climbing up a big pine tree in my backyard and just sitting there and reading a book. So I always felt that connection to nature. But I didn't have access to mountains when I was a kid. And so, like you said, I didn't even start climbing or thinking about it until I was well into my 20s. And it wasn't, I didn't put, at that point, I didn't make this connection between like, oh, nature's important to me and these mountains seem like an interesting place to hang out. Maybe I'll gain something from being there. It was more like I wanted to go climbing to prove people wrong. And
Right. It was kind of out of spite, right? That
totally out of spite.
in a
Yeah.
lot of the experience or what I read in the book, and you not being, I guess, open enough to ask for help, right? Other than a family
Yeah.
member that helped you out. Can you kind of just tell us how you started? Because I think a ton of people make this mistake. It's very uncomfortable to know nothing about something that you want to do and to ask for help. Like we see it all the time in the fly fishing world and stuff like that. You have guys that go out and they spend all this money on all this equipment, or women, and they're buying the wrong stuff, or they're not doing it right, or it even comes down to mishandling like fish the right way or and stuff. When we've had a ton of guides on, it's like if you would just kind of come out of your comfort zone and ask sometimes, or get a guide or a coach or something like that, you will gain so much ground, and it's so much better for the environment, and it's just kind of a trickle down effect. But
Yeah.
I've done the same thing. It's embarrassing to ask somebody how to do something sometimes, especially when it's in kind of that world and you're surrounded by people that do it all the
Yeah.
time, right? And like
Yeah.
you can read all
Absolutely.
the books that you want, and there's some great information in that, but the real life experience and having some of those things can go a long ways. For somebody to go into REI, you can spend thousands of dollars if you want, but it doesn't make you any better at mountain climbing, right? And I,
No.
I love that fact that you put this in this book. And can we just kind of dive into that, like how you started, maybe some of the mistakes that you might have made, and some people that
Oh,
helped you
man.
out along the way to realize, hey, this is something that takes a little bit more attention, or this pack is too heavy.
Yeah, this pack is too heavy was a big motivator for sure. So I started just sort of hiking, right? Easy hikes around Seattle, and in Seattle, we very rarely can see Mount Rainier, even though it's like 90 miles away. I forget the stat. I know it's in the book of like we can see it from Seattle like 25 days a year or something
Really?
ridiculous. And so it's a big event when it is out, and we say the mountain is out. We have this whole phrase for when it happens. And so eventually I started seeing this mountain like looming in the distance, and I was like, I gotta go check that out. No idea, again, like what I was doing, but I knew enough to realize that if I was going to attempt climbing Mount Rainier, that I needed a guide. And so this is all in my like investigation of climbing. I had also researched, groups in the Seattle area, like mountain climbing groups, and unfortunately, probably for my matriculation, did not join one early on in my career as a climber because to your point, I would have learned a lot if I was with an organized, focused group of people whose intention was to introduce and teach people about the mountains. But I took the hard route and decided I would just hire a guide to climb Mount Rainier, and was not successful that first year. I will say, like on paper, the reason that I didn't summit was because of weather. But looking back, I'm not sure that I could have done it, to be honest. I climbed with my team to just over 11,000 feet, and had this giant, unwieldy purple backpack that probably weighed, I don't know, 45 pounds. And the pack itself probably weighed like 8 pounds, which, looking back on that now, it's just so ridiculous. I probably had like a full jar of peanut butter in there. I'm sure I had all these unnecessary things. And I remember it being so hard. And then that motivated me, right? I felt like I got to figure this out. Like I'm seeing all these other people, mostly men around me, who are doing this, and it looks easy to them. Like they're making it look easy and simple. What am I missing that I'm like struggling and panting to get up this mountain? And so it was really that sparked my curiosity. And it was also still, I wanted to prove people wrong. I wanted to prove that I could do this thing that is so hard. And so started working with a few mountain guides in the Seattle area and learning from them and being like it wasn't for me hard at that point to raise my hand because I knew that I knew nothing about what I was getting into. And I also realized that this isn't something that you should enter into without the right kind of skill and knowledge. And so at that point, it became easy for me to go to a professional and say, I want to figure this out. And my goal is, at that point to climb Mount Rainier. What do I need to do? And how do I need to train, which is another big part of climbing, is being physically prepared. And, now I'm fortunate I have my own company where I coach mountaineers, but back then I knew zero about endurance training, nothing about what it took physically to climb a mountain. And so I just became curious and I asked in the beginning. And then eventually I started to, as we do, like in fly fishing, I'm sure it's the same. You now have a group of friends who are into that, share that same interest. And so I would intentionally seek out friends who knew a little bit more than me in the mountains. So I have a great friend, Bridget, who is a really good rock climber. I knew more when we met about alpine climbing. And so we would go out together and like share and teach each other. And so I really, I intentionally found friends that I could learn from. And I was upfront about, it wasn't like, hey, I'm just being your friend so I can learn something from you. Like that was just part of our friendship,
Right.
friendship that
Hey, it's a give take, right?
It is.
Yeah.
It is. But I think looking back, and to your point about what I could have done better differently, I would have sought out an organized group that's focused on teaching people how to move safely and have fun in the mountains. And that would have definitely been a much less bumpy road to me learning about mountaineering.
Sure. I think the other interesting thing, too, that really caught me is you dove into this like full clip. Just you fell in love with it. It became something after summiting Mount Rainier, correct? Was your first
Yep. Yep.
Is that 14,000 feet, or it's somewhere right around there, right?
14.4. Yeah.
14.4,
14.4.
yeah. So that, I mean,
Yep.
that's a huge feat. By any mountaineering standards, we have a ton of them here in Colorado, and it's kind of a sought after thing. Some are more dangerous than others, and that
Yep.
goes across the world. But you fell in love with this so much that you wanted to take it to that next level and do Everest. Was kind of, the Himalayas were kind of in the scope of like, okay, this is what I'm training for. This is kind of my new
Right.
purpose. And you turned it into like, I'm going to become a professional athlete, basically, or train like one and
Yep.
revolve my life around it. And
Yeah.
you had some drastic life changes that kind of happened. You were dealing with a relationship that wasn't so healthy. You
Yep.
were also diagnosed with cancer during the midst of all of this, and kind of your sights being set on that. And I think it's super commendable that you didn't just quit and like, hey, or use that as an excuse or a crutch. It's really
Oh
kind
yeah.
of what got you through some of your cancer treatments and personal stuff that was happening in your life. And I think more importantly, not that anything positive comes out of cancer, but I feel like you did gain something positively reading this. Like it
Oh
was
yeah.
kind of a wake up moment. Like, am I happy in my career? Am I happy in my life? And I think so many people can get stuck in just kind of the day to day grind and the rut. It's like, and there's nothing wrong with that too. People can find success and gratitude and accomplishment in a career as well. But for you, it just wasn't. That wasn't filling the cup. So,
It was not.
yeah, can we? I guess I want to hear more about that and go do a deep dive on that a little bit more, because I thought one of the interesting things was, even when you were told, that first couple days, it kind of sounded like, okay, I got to take this all in. But then it was like pulling yourself up and being like, okay, I'm still planning on climbing Everest on this date. And it was in the middle of your trip, like a few months away from having your last treatment.
Right. Right.
And you waking up that morning and not being able to walk to the mailbox, but this is still the goal or the bar.
Yeah. Yeah.
Where does that drive come from, and how did that really change your life, I guess? Because I have some close friends that are supreme athletes, and some of them are dealing with cancer right now too.
Oh
And
man.
I've had family members that have battled it, and I think everybody kind of takes a different approach. But
For sure. And I think that it makes we should all take a different approach, right? We should find what works for us. For me, so I was diagnosed with breast cancer in 2015, and it was just I had climbed I think three of the seven summits at that point, so three of the highest points on a continent. Um, and I was like mountaineering was becoming part of my identity. It was every year I picked a different peak somewhere in the world, and that was my goal. And I really arranged my life and my finances around preparing for that and learning about it and hopefully successfully climbing it. And so it was part of who I was. And in 2015, I felt like I was skilled enough and ready to start climbing in the Himalaya. So, the Himalaya being a giant mountain range that bisects Asia, and most of the highest peaks in the world are there. And in mountaineering, when we say high, we're usually talking about mountains that are over 26,000 feet or 8,000 meters. And so it was a really big deal for me to be
which, and I
like,
don't mean to interrupt you, but just to put it in perspective for, we have a ton of listeners that might not live in the mountains or are
yeah,
interested in mountaineering, but they don't really understand the scope of it.
yeah,
So here in Colorado, I think our highest peak is 4,900 or something like that,
meters.
48,
Yep.
or I'm sorry, 14,800. You're talking about a mountain that's almost double the
Double.
size in elevation.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Yes.
Anyways,
Yes. Yes.
big
Double the
mountains. Yeah.
size, like as high. When your plane is taking off and the pilot says we've reached our cruising altitude of 28,000 feet, like that high, that high, and it was a really big deal for me to think and to believe that I was ready to take on one of those mountains, and so I chose an 8,000 meter peak. that was easy. There's, of course, a spectrum, of difficulty and challenge and risk amongst 8,000 meter peaks. There's only 14 of them in the whole world. And so I chose an easy one, which was 8,160 meters. It's called Manaslu in Nepal. And I was like, for me to pick a new mountain goal, especially at that point in my career, it's like Christmas to me. Like, I feel like I have this like fun new project that I get to focus on and learn about and train for and get to know. I get to know this mountain, and I get to prepare myself mentally and physically so that I'm ready for whatever that mountain is going to expect of me. So I love that part of preparation. So that's where I was at the beginning of 2015. I had a routine mammogram before work one day. I was, frustrated that I had this sort of distraction going on in my life. At that point was really focused on growing my career. And I remember sitting in the room after the exam, and the radiologist walked in. And because I had worked in healthcare and I'd worked specifically in medical imaging, I knew that was not a standard protocol. That's not what had happened in the mammogram I had the year before. And so I knew something wasn't right. And, she very delicately explained what she had seen in the mammogram, and that there was concern that I had tumors in my left breast. And instantly I knew I had cancer. That wasn't a diagnosis. It was just a concern at that point, but there was just this absolute certainty in my body and in my mind that I had cancer. And broke down, as you probably should when you get that sort of information. Remember, like, just wiping the tears off my eyes, going back to the office, and just acting like nothing happened. And so fast forward, climbing became my focal point to get me through cancer. I was so adamant that I didn't want cancer to dictate my priorities, which is a little bit ridiculous, I think, to say now, looking back. But I just didn't want to give up who I was, and I did not want to give up this goal of climbing Manaslu that fall. And so all my doctors knew that was my objective, and they were very kind to, sort of say, like, they were on my team, right? They were helping me to reach that goal still.
So there was nobody holding you back at that point? I'm sure, were there family members or anything? Because, like, some of the crazy stuff that I've wanted to do in my life, or I've had happen in my life, people have just told me, like, no, you can't do that, or you need to be really careful, or just like, there's 80% of people will tell you can't do something before you can actually do it. And your own mind even tells you that, it's like, you doubt yourself, so.
Yes. And that, for me, I'm sure some of your listeners are like this. That is, if you want to motivate me, tell me I can't do it. Tell me I shouldn't do it. Because that just puts me into another gear where I'm going to make sure that you're wrong and I can't do it. And that has softened a lot since those days, but it's still a big motivation for me. And yes, you're right. There were lots of people who were saying, like, I think you should just take it easy. If you don't, that mountain's still going to be there. If you're not able to make it, it's going to be okay. You need to focus on being healthy. And they were right. They were absolutely right. I just, for me, I needed to at least try. And when I left for Manaslu that year, it was the first time I traveled to Nepal, and I knew I could just feel my body wasn't 100%, and I didn't know what it was capable of. My doctors knew what I was doing. They had no points of reference, no, like, hey, there's this body of study that says if you've just had a mastectomy, you shouldn't climb to 8,000. Like, nobody knew. And so, similar to that first attempt on Rainier, avalanche risk turned us back on our way to the summit. And I remember being a little bit relieved that time. I remember being like, I got what I came for on this climb. And I was disappointed for sure, but I also felt like I had pushed my body about as far as I needed to. And coming when I got back to Seattle, I realized that I had learned so much more on that mountain, probably by not summiting, than I would if I had stood on the summit, because it really just solidified for me how fragile life is and how we get one shot at this life, and it's up to us to define what that life is going to look and be like. And so I became very committed then to reprioritizing, to, ending that relationship that wasn't working. I quit my corporate job. I decided that I would climb Mount Everest, which prior to that really wasn't on my radar. I was sort of like, oh, it's, sort of, so there were other mountains that were more interesting to me. But after that diagnosis and beating cancer, I felt like, why wouldn't I climb the highest mountain in the world? And so that's when I became very focused on Everest.
Absolutely. And I think you hitting the point and explaining this in the book, that sometimes you gain much more out of failure than you realize, right? Or than actually accomplishing. Like, if it was just easy to accomplish, then you might not appreciate it as much, right? But if you fail at something a couple times, those are memories that stick in your head, in other
Yeah.
people's heads. You know, it's weird how the human mind and body works sometimes. And a lot of people dwell on failures for that very reason. It's like, God, I didn't complete
Yep.
this. I didn't meet my goal. But I love how
Yep.
you explained it in this, that how much you actually do gain from it. And I think it's so true. It's
Oh
been true
yeah.
in my life in a ton of different aspects. I think
Yep.
being fearful and failing at something are two of the best things that you can go through as a human, that builds resilience, perseverance, discipline,
Yeah.
and much more, So,
Yep.
yeah, that's awesome. Can you let's rewind a little bit? Because I've always wondered, I mean, I've been all over the world. I've never been on a mountaineering experience like this. Like, it's funny when I have free time to be in the mountains or be somewhere. I love the Northwest, like Northern California, the Cascade Mountains, Alberta, BC is
Yeah.
amazing, Northern Montana. Like, those are the spots that I want to go, but really Colorado, because it's home, and there's so much to do here. I don't think that I would ever get on a plane and fly to Nepal and experience. What is that experience like, getting, all that travel and then
Yeah.
getting integrated in the culture, and there's some traditions that
Yes.
happen before you start climbing
Yeah.
these mountains, like prayers and certain meals, and
Yep.
integrating with people that live at that elevation, which is
Right.
kind of crazy
Right.
too, right? Like,
Right.
can you explain some of those just for our
Yes.
listeners that haven't experienced it, or maybe are thinking about it, or maybe they want to experience it through your
Yeah.
adventures?
Yeah. So I Nepal, most mountaineers will say this. Most people who've traveled to Nepal will say this. It is a very sort of special place for me now, having been there 4 or 5 times. And that first trip, I had no idea what to expect. I had, watched YouTube videos, talked to other people. I remember landing in the Kathmandu airport and it was utter chaos. And I sort of, felt like I stood out, right? Because I was obviously American, blonde, taller than most people, and I'm not a tall person. And I had all these giant duffel bags, and I was trying to be as inconspicuous as possible because I didn't want to run into any other climbers who might ask me what I was climbing, and I would have to, I wasn't confident enough to say, like, this is what I'm doing. So that first trip, I was very sort of on edge, right? And I was like on guard, and everything was unknown to me at that point. And then gradually, I started to have conversations with Nepalese, whether they were Sherpa who were working in the mountains or Nepalese that resided in Kathmandu, and just really soften to the people and the culture of that country and learn so much about what's important to them, how they view the mountains, how they're often sacred places. Some peaks we don't actually go to the tippy top of because they're considered sacred. And I really just, that became this very important support system to me, that I just felt like I had this whole culture of people who revered the mountains as much as I did, who were there to help me be successful and to support me. And I, now am fortunate to have many Nepalese who are friends who, come and stay with me when they're in the US. And I've learned so much just about Buddhism and their beliefs and their families and food and how they think of the mountains, that it's just such a part of who I am.
It's
And some of the
almost,
special.
I'm sorry to interrupt. It's almost like a religion, right? And
Yeah.
I was wondering, with your connection, you talked about in the book and some other interviews that I've heard of yours, like having a relationship with the mountain when you're climbing it, like having a feeling of like
Yeah.
being welcome or not welcome, whether it's weather. And I've experienced some of those things like that where it's just like if you're climbing at, 11:05, you're at the tree line and a thunderstorm can roll in or a microburst here in Colorado happens all the
Yeah.
time, and it is like it's terrifying
Serious.
at that at that elevation.
Yeah.
It's like, oh my god, maybe there is a god, or that sort of type of feeling like there's something bigger. um do you think that like traveling and being immersed in those cultures made you appreciate that or have that feeling or that kind of
Yeah.
perspective a little bit more?
I do. Yeah, I totally do. I think often I hear in Western cultures, like, I conquered that mountain. And
Right.
that just doesn't make sense to me, because to me, the mountain is always in charge, it's always in control. I am a tiny little speck that is asking for safe passage on this mountain. And so you mentioned ceremonies. There's a really beautiful ceremony that occurs before any climb in the Himalaya called a puja. And it's, very like it's solemn in the beginning and then very celebratory at the end. But the intention, and it's led by a lama, the intention is that anyone who is endeavoring to climb on that particular peak sits at the base of that peak and asks the mountain for safe passage and for a blessing to travel safely on that particular peak. And that those puja ceremonies have become just so important to me, and to the Nepalese is obviously as well. It's a part of their culture, to sit there solemnly. And sometimes it's emotional. Like before I climbed K2, it was very emotional to sit there at the base of this enormous, daunting mountain and think about, I'm endeavoring to climb in this place that is potentially unsafe, where other people have died, and I'm asking and hoping that I have a different faith in them. And I'm putting, my trust, yes, in my team and in my preparation, but I'm asking the mountain as well to allow me to travel safely. And so I do think I have integrated that kind of reverence that comes from the Sherpa people into how I view mountains. And I don't, the idea of conquering doesn't make sense to me. The idea of like working together to achieve this goal does make sense to me. And there were times, particularly on K2, when I just felt like, man, I don't know if this mountain wants me here. Like all these, it's just like
Right.
every day there's something that makes me stop and think about whether I'm doing the right thing and I really should be here. Um, and I talk about on K2 in particular how I just, as I was descending, it really became a prayer, like, please, like I thanked the mountain and I said, please keep me safe. And I just kept repeating that phrase over and over and over again. And luckily, things went well on that mountain. But for me, a big part of climbing, a big part of my ethic is to respect and work with the mountain.
And do the Sherpas, I mean, they obviously, this is where they live, they hold it so sacred. I feel like that's a common thing that connection is lost here in America, right? Like it's
Yeah.
more, we treat a lot of our national parks like they're amusement space, right? And I think unless you've grown up and had some of those influences and like that culture, like me growing up in Colorado, my family homesteaded some of the areas that I live in. We recreated in the same spots for
Wow.
generations, and we were taught, clean, leave it better than you found it, basically, right? And
Yep.
I can't count how many times we pull into a campsite and people have left trash in the fire pit for somebody else to burn, or um, and I don't think that they're doing it intentionally. I think it's just if you grow up in an inner city, you have somebody that cleans up after you. There is a trash service, there is street sweepers. Um, that's kind of that philosophy. And if you don't know any better, or you don't know some of the etiquette or ethics behind outdoor stuff, I encourage you to get educated. And I think it also comes down to our state affiliated, um, you know, game and fish or whoever it is, like, hey, this certain amount of sunscreen will pollute our rivers,
Yeah.
or,
Yeah.
there's so many, it's such a fragile line in such a beautiful space. Just simply to how to use the restroom. And it's uncomfortable to talk about, but there should be some sort of like manual or guide, and that's kind of the gap that we're trying to fill here. I mean, I'm sure that the Sherpas aren't like throwing their waste on the side of the mountain or
Right.
on the
Right.
trail, or if they come across somebody else's something that they might have dropped, they're probably cleaning it up, right? Because it is a sacred area. Did
Yeah.
did you
And
kind of
and to
notice
me,
that?
and for sure, I noticed both things happening. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
the mountains, because they're, Everest, for example, has become known as a place where there is still a lot of trash because there hasn't been an effort, like you said, from the local government to enforce that trash to be carried down the mountain. And other mountains, like on Aconcagua, your trash is actually measured as you exit the mountain to make sure that it's comparable to the amount of time that you stayed there. So I think requirements and regulations by local governments make a huge difference. And things are changing in Nepal. And I think the people who live there and who work in the mountains revere that space and want to protect it and want it to remain sacred. But not everyone who recreates there or travels there feels the same way. And because there haven't been strict guidelines, it's created, we've probably most people or many people have seen pictures of trash at camps on Mount Everest. So it's getting better for sure. And I think it's up to each of us to do. Like, I have this thing where I just pick up micro trash every time I'm on the trail.
Yeah.
Like, you would be surprised at the things like hair clips, tons of like corners of Cliff Bars or of, snacks, like so many things that I think just happen to fall out of a pocket and people don't realize. So I think it's up to all of us to do what little we can in the environments that we love to help keep them beautiful and clean and safe for everyone who wants to go there. Because it really saddens me when I see like those pictures of Everest with just trash everywhere.
I couldn't agree more, and I think it to take it even a step further, just like even if you live in a Seattle or in a city like Seattle, sorry, or a city like Denver, you might not realize that mylar balloon that you bought for your kid's birthday that
Yes.
flew away is going to end up on a 14,000 peak. I find them all the time. It's
Oh my gosh.
insane. Like you'll be,
Wow.
7 or 8 miles in the backcountry, and here's this beautiful mylar balloon that you can see from a mile away.
I was stuck in a tree.
Right. And it goes even further than that. Like if a bear gets into your trash can or an animal or something, that ends up in the ditch, and then it ends up in a spillway that then ends up in a river somewhere. It can end up in nature even if it's in the inner city. So I think like just collectively starting there, obviously when you're out, pack your trash out, that sort of thing.
Yep.
Um, you know, Going back to mountaineering and some of the things that you've done, I kind of wanted to ask you, I mean, going to Nepal and some of these other countries like Pakistan, Australia, all these places that you've been to have time and spend time accomplishing your goals. I'm so sorry. Can you hear me now?
I can, yeah. Did
I
you
don't know.
did
I
you
guess our internet connection
Okay.
dropped, so I'm hot spotting from the phone. So hopefully it'll be
Oh
all right
gosh.
now.
Okay.
I don't know what happened, but this is the joy of living in the mountains. This is why
Yes,
we
it is.
prefer to record in person too. This isn't the first
Yeah.
time it's happened. So, okay.
It
So
looks like
sorry,
it's
we're
still
back.
recording.
You lost me for a minute. My question was financially.
Oh
You had
yeah.
all these life changes that happened in your life. You got a divorce. You quit your job. You're dealing with cancer at the same time, so I'm sure that there's some medical bills and stuff like that involved. And at the same time, you have to try to get to Nepal, and that's not cheap.
No.
How did you kind of construct that? I mean, that takes a ton of strategy just from a financial standpoint.
Yeah, it's like financial origami, I feel like. And I sat down like so many spreadsheets, so many notebooks where I was just like, if I do this and sell this and, quit my job on this date and cash this out, like, how can I make this all come together? And I think it's important to note that because there's this sort of belief that people who climb big mountains are very wealthy and like have this disposable money, and there's certainly an element of that, but that is not the case for many people, myself included. And so I was making all these life decisions that impacted me financially, and at the same time had this big goal to climb Mount Everest, and ended up borrowing $50,000. I literally remember calling my bank. I was sitting in a conference room in my office, and I thought, I'm just going to tell them up front what I want to do. And they're going to say no, and at least I will have explored that option and I can move on to the next one. And I have a great relationship with my bank, and they like pulled the recording from the phone call, and I like blurred out my name, and I said, I want to borrow $50,000 to climb Mount Everest. And I just sat there. And the woman on the other end, who's now a friend of mine, is like, okay, we'll see what we can do. And I was just like, are you kidding me? Like, I'm just going to go climb a mountain. I'm not going to like send my kid to college. Like, this is a total frivolous thing. And it ended up obviously working out. And afterwards, like, spoke for my bank. And it was just a great relationship and a great, like, I couldn't have done it without them. And literally
That's
could not
amazing.
have climbed without that financial support from them. Yeah. So I don't, in hindsight, it worked out, but it was terrifying, terrifying to think about. I'm, ending my source of income, which was stable and predictable. I'm going to say goodbye to that. I am ending a relationship, so no sort of financial safety net there. And I'm going to borrow an absurd amount of money to go climb a mountain. And I hope it all works out. And there was a lot of faith and a lot of hope. And it did. In the end, it absolutely did. But it was really scary at the time. And yet there was this little, because going back to what you said, Bobby, about people telling you shouldn't do something. There were a lot of people who were like, you should not quit your stable job. You've worked very hard for decades to get here. And I just knew that I was on the right path, that like diversion from, sort of mainstream employment felt right to me. And it felt right to me to be investing my focus and my energy in the mountains. And it obviously has worked out. I have no regrets. But at the time, it was terrifying.
I can't imagine. And my friend calls it burning the boats. It's just
Oh,
like you
yeah.
show up to a spot and you burn the boats, and
Yeah.
like make sure that spot is someplace that you want to be. So it's a great analogy,
Yeah.
and shout out to Evan for always having that
Yeah.
perspective, because he's been a big influence in my life of like, hey, should I start this thing? And he's like, what are you doing? Burn the boats, dude. Like, like,
I love that.
yeah,
I would use
he's
that.
just an all in or nothing type guy.
I
So
like it.
I love that. Okay, so you go, and it's at Monteslu. Am I saying that right?
Yeah, Monteslu
Okay,
was the first 8,000-meter peak that I
sure.
attempted.
You attempted that. You didn't quite make it to the summit on that.
Mm-hmm.
The next mountain in that scope was that Everest at that
Was
point? Like, because
Everest.
Monteslu was kind of a training to,
Yes.
right? And you didn't get some of the stuff done there that you wanted to, like uh,
Right.
oxygen training and like some of
Right.
this other things. Like some of these mountains are so high in elevation, and I know just being at like 11.5 or 12.5 and having a pack on at that point, you start breathing hard. So I can't imagine what it's like at 21,000 feet or something like
Yeah.
that. The air is so much thinner. So some of these climbs are oxygen assisted, right, to even make it happen. And
Yep.
I guess climbing Everest, does it live up to the lore? Is it kind of, because it's become such a tourist thing, and it is like kind of the pinnacle of like, if I guess it's a very Hollywood mountain, right? There's been a ton of movies that have been made about it.
True.
Is is it as dramatizing as you see? I mean, are you passing dead people on the trail that are frozen, and like that whole
Yeah.
lore of it kind of?
Yeah. It can be. So I didn't see any dead people on Everest. People have asked me that question many times. There was a lot of snow the year I was there, and so that covered, thankfully, all the bodies that reside there. Um, I think Everest will always have this attraction because it's the highest peak in the world. And, I see that in my, like, just a microcosm of that in my life. If I'm, meeting new friends or at a dinner party or something, and people will say, "Oh, you climbed Mount Everest. That's amazing." I'll be like, "Yeah, but I climbed this other mountain called K2, and it's like way harder, way more." And they're like, "Yeah, but tell me about Everest. Did you see any dead people?" So it's always going to have, it's the highest mountain. Like you said, it's much more mainstream and well known because it's been highlighted in many movies and books. And so for that reason, I think it's always going to be exciting, and people always will endeavor to climb there. And it's difficult, right? I mean, like, and a big part of the difficulty is just the lack of oxygen due to its elevation. And so it's always going to have, I think, this excitement around it. There are lots of other mountains that are way more difficult to climb, that I don't have the skill to climb or to attempt even. But I think people will always be excited about it. Yeah.
Yeah, no, and that kind of brings me to the next question, and what I want to spend most of the time on is your experience on K2, because
Yeah.
you were the second woman in the U.S. to climb that, if I'm correct,
Right.
right?
To summit. Yep.
Yeah, to summit. And can you just kind of walk us through that experience, like from the start, like from traveling in, kind of some of the unnerving stuff? Like, this is basically, if you're into mountaineering, this is the pinnacle, right? Like, this is
Right.
the hardest thing that you're going to accomplish on our planet that we know of, right? From a
Right.
mountaineering standpoint,
Right.
like, there's ice, snow, rock, there's all these different variables. Weather, you have to go at a certain time, right,
Mm-hmm.
to actually summit, and have to be down by a certain time. So
Yep.
can you walk me through the whole process of that? I'd love to hear about it.
Yeah. I K2 sort of fell into my consciousness years before I even told anybody I wanted to climb it. So it is the second highest mountain in the world, and it's 28,251 feet, so about 800 feet shorter than Mount Everest, and it's on the border between Pakistan and China. So a very remote part of the world. And it is known for just monster storms that sort of come out of nowhere, and the weather is very unpredictable there. It is also much, much steeper than Mount Everest, and it's steep like from the second you leave advanced base camp. It's just, you know, straight up. And it's very remote. So on Everest, for example, there is at base camp, there's, an emergency room tent that's manned by doctors who volunteer from all over the world, and there are commercial helicopters on Everest who will pluck you off of, very high on the mountain if you need help, and then take you to Kathmandu to a hospital. So there's, this really solid support and infrastructure around climbing that mountain that doesn't exist in Pakistan. And that's part of the lure, for some people, myself included, is to be in this really remote place where you have to rely on yourself and your team to get up and down the mountain safely. And so I felt like, as many people do, like, wow, if I could climb K2, like, that would just feel like legit. And I hadn't yet climbed Everest. I wasn't ready to tell anyone that it was even on my radar. So for years, I just sort of silently, like, got more skill, climbed different peaks to gain more experience with that goal in mind. And when I started to tell people about K2, back to being, doubted and told that you shouldn't do something, there was a lot of that. There was a lot of people who just said flat out, like, you shouldn't, you're crazy. You should not attempt this peak. Because at the time, the death rate was about 1 in 4. So
Wow.
25% of people who attempted didn't come back. And, that's not something to be taken lightly. It's not something to be flippant about. It's the facts. And the people who loved me, I recognized that that was coming from a place of love and concern in them. But similar to when I was, sort of blowing up my life in 2016 by quitting my job, I just felt this. I knew I was on the right path. I knew I had a lot of work to do, but I knew that I could get ready to at least attempt this peak. And so when I left Seattle, this is in 2018, I was terrified. I knew I was fit and ready physically and emotionally, mentally to climb that peak, but I didn't know if I could do it. I just didn't know if I was reaching too far. And I told myself I was going to just climb as far as I can and not ever let my ambition outweigh my ability. So just be very serious about, can I do this and should I continue? And so traveling to Pakistan, I traveled there by myself, as a Western woman, and I've been there twice now. And the first time I remember, like, I was in like fight mode when I got off the plane. I was ready to just like, nobody's gonna mess with me. I don't know what I expected. I probably should have done more research because the experience was the exact opposite.
Really?
And my experience from the people I've interacted with in Pakistan has been similar to the people I've interacted with in Nepal. Everyone's been very gracious and welcoming, like I've been treated like a guest in their country. So all of what I'd worked myself up for did not happen.
It's so weird how we judge books by a
Yeah.
cover. It's like
Yeah.
you told all this stuff, you see all this stuff in your media, you grew up with it, your parents
Right.
telling you this sort of stuff,
Right.
and you
Right.
get there sometimes and you're like, this is amazing.
It was great. I
Yeah.
was always treated very respectfully, and I did my best to I recognize I am a guest in your country, and would cover my head, and like I felt like I did my best to show respect, and I felt like I received respect in return. Um, and I remember sitting in the hotel in Islamabad, and those same feelings that I had the first time I went to Nepal were there. I didn't want anyone to know that I was attempting K2. I wanted them to think I was just a regular tourist hanging out in Islamabad. And there's this thing that happens, where when you meet your team, you're sort of sizing each other up. And I felt I was the only woman on the team. I had experience, but I just felt like, wow, how am I going to live up to these guys? And, who am I to think that I can take on this huge, daunting, dangerous mountain? So there was a whole lot of mental work that I had to do sort of in the moment to get myself to believe that I was capable of climbing K2.
What are the anxiety levels like at that point? I mean, are you sleeping the night before you start this ascent, or like, there's no way, right? Like, you
Yeah,
guys,
no.
I mean, I've had some big moments in my life, whether it's been career wise or stuff that I've competed in or whatever. And it's just like, when that anxiety level is there, you're not
Yeah.
getting any sort of sleep or anything
No,
like
you're
that.
not. And the process of climbing any big mountain, this is important for people to know too. You don't just go to base camp and then start climbing up the mountain, because you have to take the time to force your body to acclimatize to the elevation. So the way that we do that is to, from base camp, climb to camp one and then spend a night there, and then go back to base camp for a few days to rest and recover. And then from there, go to camp one and spend another night, then camp two and spend a night, and then back down to base camp. So
So
on
essentially,
big,
you're climbing the mountain twice almost.
multiple times, right?
Wow.
Right. On K2, we deviate from that a little bit because it's such a dangerous mountain, and you want to, reduce the amount of time you spend in that danger zone as much as possible, but it's still multiple iterations up the mountain.
Wow. You're on the mountain at this point. You're with your team. How do you guys? I'm sure that there's a bond that cannot be broken once you actually start the ascent and you've gone through some adversity and stuff like that.
Yes, yes.
Um, you start to find your team? I don't think I've gotten this far in the book yet, but
Yeah.
just yet. But I'm gonna continue to read it too because I'm involved in it now. Um, so at this point, are you starting to build some camaraderie? Or are you guys helping each other?
Yeah.
Is the team accepting you now, being the only woman on the team? And
So there actually was one other woman on that team, a woman climbing from Prague, and so it was so nice to have Clara there with me because we totally started to bond and support each other and sort of decide how we became our own little group inside of this, broader climbing team. Um, some of the men I got along with very well, and some I just didn't. I felt like they had, a different vibe and different intentions and were more like into conquering the mountain than really respecting it. And that just wasn't my ethic. And that can make me like spend a lot of energy and a lot of cycles on like trying to like, why are you thinking about it that way? And like trying to control the situation. And I'm better, especially on a mountain, if I just create this bubble around me and like do my own thing. And so fortunately I had Clara with me and we could create that sort of support that we needed. She unfortunately had to turn around between camps 2 and 3, so it was, me and the rest of the team and the Sherpa I was with climbing above that. But there is this like, and I write about this a bit in the book, that there's this natural human thing that happens when you meet people in a very competitive, high stakes, intense environment like that. And I think we all naturally assess like, who's going to be the weak one here? Who's going to be the strong one? Who's going to be the person that I'm going to be annoyed by? So all of that happens, and I think it's important to recognize that it's just a normal part of, forming, storming, norming.
Selection process, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
it's very normal. But eventually we started climbing K2, and we had, challenges, not quite from the beginning, but the weather was a very big, as it always is, a very big challenge that we had to deal with. And we actually had climbed up to Camp 3, so high on the mountain, almost to the 26,000 foot point. And we thought we had a solid weather window. So when you leave base camp for your final summit rotation, you need about 5 days of good weather in order to get to the summit and back safely. And according to the forecast and the models, we had that. And then when we got to Camp 3, the snow, so there was just this snowstorm that came and produced way more precipitation than we thought it would, than it was forecasted to. So there was probably 6 feet of snow by the time we got to Camp 3. And that was, I believe, 5 more than was predicted. And so now we have a big risk of avalanches. And because real estate is so sparse on K2, we were sort of climbing in tandem with another team, and they were a day ahead of us. And so the idea was, they would go to Camp 2, and then when they left Camp 2, we would arrive at Camp 2, and we would just take their tents and everything would be set, and it reduced, the amount of infrastructure that we had to carry up the mountain and allowed us to just work together and share. And so we're at Camp 3 now, 25,000 feet. Storm still blowing outside, snow still piling up outside of my tent, and we're supposed to climb to Camp 4 that day. But the team above us has even more snow than we do. And so they can't go to the summit because it's unsafe, which means we can't go to Camp 4 because we'd have no place to stay. And so what ensued, there's so many parallels in climbing to like leadership and teamwork and resilience. And so there was, very big meeting outside of our tents at Camp 3 to talk about what the right thing was to do. Like, should we descend? And for a long time, that was the decision that we should go down. The storm was not going to break anytime soon. We were, we couldn't climb any higher because that team didn't feel like they could move higher. And it created a lot of dissent within the group that wasn't, there were people who were very adamant about summiting, people who were very adamant about returning. And so as a team, we had to decide what the right thing was to do. So you can imagine all these stubborn mountaineers standing in the snow at 25,000 feet, deciding. I know.
That's awesome.
I was on cue.
Yeah.
Temperature, we're getting mad about the situation. Things are sort of rising, and was not really a pretty moment standing at 25,000 feet deciding what we should do as a team. And eventually my tent mate and I were able to get a second weather forecast by contacting his wife in Belgium, who contacted another meteorologist in a different country that sent us an updated forecast that said that the snowstorm should stop that night. And
Mm.
so with that new information, we felt as a team like the best thing to do was at least wait one more day at 25,000 feet and then assess what we could do and what the team above us could do in the morning. And so thankfully, that forecast was accurate. We waited, the snow consolidated, and we could all then safely move up the mountain. But it was a very tenuous point in the climb where things could have gone either way. And on a mountain like K2, you don't just descend to base camp and wait a couple of days and think, we're going to go back up again. You're spent at that point. You've been on the mountain for 4 to 6 weeks. You're running out of food. People have commitments back home. So I feel very fortunate that as a team, we made the decision that we did. And we all climbed safely and summited and returned safely.
With all your training and the amount of time that you've spent on some of these mountains at some of these elevations, does your body ever get used to it, or are you just in discomfort like 90% of the time?
Both. I
Okay.
think both happen. I do think, I don't know that there's data to support this, but and maybe you experience this too on 14ers, that, like you said, you start to feel if you're carrying a heavy pack, you get to like 11,000 feet and you're like, oh yeah, I remember how hard this is. And I feel like there's some sort of muscle memory or some process in your body that says like, oh yeah, I remember what this is like. And, here's how I adapt to that. Also, there's a certain point, I would say probably above 26,000 feet, where your body is just breaking down. Like your physiology starts to do amazing things like send blood and oxygen to the most important parts of your body, so to your brain and your heart and your lungs, and not to your digestive tract, for example. So your body adapts, but you are still uncomfortable. It is still unbelievably challenging. Even, I sitting in this chair nice and comfortable, and if I were at 26,000 feet and I had to walk across the room to get something or to go to the bathroom, it's
To
like,
get out of your pack at like nine,
yes,
even camping, at 9,000 feet when you're
yes,
in the backcountry or something in the fall, it's like, God, the last thing I want to do, I swear it feels like I've laid there for hours before and like
yes,
contemplating whether I'm going to use the restroom or not,
yes, yes.
or
And
the tree.
at a time when it is so crucial to take the best care of yourself that you
Exactly.
possibly
Yeah.
can. And so you're constantly sort of fighting, this mental, like, your body wants to just rest and be quiet and preserve all the energy that it can. And also you need to like eat and drink. I remember on Denali, so being at like 17,000 feet and having a handful of chocolate covered peanuts, like a delicious thing that I would eat a whole bowl of at sea level, and thinking I'm going to eat these in the next 20 minutes, and like forcing myself to eat them.
Right.
So it's a lot of mind overcoming the body.
That was kind of my next question. Like, how do you think it's tougher physically or mentally, or is it just both? I mean, is it a 50-50? I mean, I'm sure you're going to have those mental battles where you're talking yourself out of something, or maybe I should just descend, or maybe,
Yeah.
maybe today's not the day, or maybe what
Yep.
the hell am I doing? Like,
Yep.
yeah.
Yeah. I think both, and I think above a certain point, it is all mental. Above a certain elevation is all mental on the mountain. On K2 in particular, both of those things were like constantly at play for me. And the crux of that mountain is a rocky section called the Black Pyramid. And so it's not like beautiful rock climbing. It's more like cobbled rock. And the day I was there, it was slick with ice and melting snow. And it was the hardest part of the mountain to climb for me. And physically, I was capable of doing it. Absolutely. Like at sea level, it would have been no problem. But at 23,000 feet, wearing crampons and a down suit, and that meant that voice comes in your mind of like, can I do this? And I just constantly told myself that I was strong. I just didn't let that like loop get started that would lead me to believe that I was not capable of doing it, and instead just focused on believing that I could. So mental
That's
is a
incredible.
huge thing.
And then what is the most gratifying part of that experience? I mean, is it actually making the summit? Like for me, sometimes being at that elevation, it's like taking in the view. It's a different perspective on the world, right? Like, oh my God,
Totally.
I'm on top of this mountain. I can see 360 degrees.
Yep.
Especially like in the Cascades, you get the marine layer that comes in. Is it the
Yeah.
marine layer or whatever?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's like
Yeah.
you're above the clouds sometimes. I mean, you can't explain that to somebody unless they've seen it firsthand. You can't put it in a picture. And we've had some incredible photographers on. You might actually know Scott Kranz and Max
I do
Holloway, some of the
actually.
guys up in your
Yeah.
area. Yeah, they've
Yeah.
both been on the podcast.
That's so
Awesome
cool.
people. And that's not a knock on any of their photography because they take some amazing photos. But like to experience it firsthand, it's totally different to take it in, right? Like
Yes.
I think it puts it in a bigger perspective. So I guess at that point, with this storm and that sort of stuff, is there any sort of view, or is it like complete whiteout and you're looking at a GPS and like, okay, yeah, here's the
We're here.
elevation, we made
Yeah.
it, like what's that kind of like?
So we were above the clouds. We climbed above the clouds, which is another cool phenomenon that happens in the Cascades a lot. I don't know if it happens a lot in Colorado, but
Not very often.
yeah, where at the base of the mountain, it's raining, maybe it's cloudy, and then you climb through that and you look down and all you see is like this pillow of clouds below you, which is a really cool sight. And then there's just these black peaks poking above the cloud layer. And so that's what the view from K2 was like. And we could see for miles, but we could not see all the way down to the base of the mountain because the clouds were obscuring that. But it is a very satisfying feeling, and also I think it was Ed Viester, is a very famous mountaineer, who said the summit is only halfway. And so
Right.
I have a pretty strict, like, no celebrating rule at the top, especially of big mountains, because there's so much work to do to get back to the summit safely. And most climbing accidents happen descending, not climbing up. And so my sort of routine is to just take a minute to show some gratitude to the mountain, to people who have helped me get that far, to check my gear, get a new oxygen bottle, and then take some photos and descend. And to focus on the task ahead, the work that's still to do, as opposed to like celebrating and having a party on the summit. The party can happen later.
Yeah, and I think that that's a misconception in anything, even if you're doing a 14er, like you got to keep that
Yeah.
perspective, right? Because the
Yes.
moment that you get comfortable, you get complacent, and then that's typically when something goes wrong.
Things happen.
Same with
Yeah.
riding a motorcycle or anything like that, or a
True.
mountain bike, right? Like,
Yeah.
yeah,
Absolutely.
the moment you get too comfortable, that's
Yeah.
normally when bad
Yeah.
stuff happens. Lisa, it's totally amazing. I'm really glad that you're sharing your story with us
Thank
and
you.
you're sharing it in this book with so many people. I'm sure that we may have a listener out here that's dealing with a family member that might have cancer. I know some people firsthand that are going through that.
Yep.
And for anybody that's listening in right now that might be dealing with that, what are some things? And I think you explained a lot of this in the book, just with your goals and some of that stuff, and keeping your perspective. What would be some words of wisdom that you'd want to share with them surviving cancer, and then also completing some of your goals in mountaineering? And I don't think anybody needs to run out and be like, I have cancer now, I'm going to go climb Everest, or K2's on the radar, right? Like it takes a special human to do that. But just for your everyday person, what are some things that kind of helped you get through that mentally, get over that hump, and just stay focused on, okay, this is what I want to do?
Yeah. I I have thought a lot about that question, and the answer has evolved a lot for me. When I was first diagnosed with cancer, what kept me going was just one thing at a time, right? Like, not, I had to really watch myself from getting too spun up about things that were going to happen in the future, or what if this or what if that, without having all of the data and information in front of me. And that process, that the waiting, the like trying to understand what your life is going to be like, is heavy and overwhelming and stifling. And so I had to tell myself just to do one more thing. Like, today, what is the one thing I'm going to do? And sometimes it was, I'm going to wash my hair. And that was it. But that was enough to keep me like focused and motivated on taking care of myself. In hindsight, and this is how, my answer to that question has changed, what I didn't do was give myself enough time to like feel the emotion of what was happening in my life and in my body and around me. I was very good at just like one foot in front of the other. I'm going to go climb this mountain. I'm going to, check off the next thing on my to-do list. And eventually that catches up with you. You can't keep like ignoring those feelings and that emotion forever. And so my advice now would be to take the time that you need to feel that and to work through it, and ask for help if you need it. Surround yourself with people who are positive and supportive and are on your team and wanting to beat cancer just as much as you do.
Yeah, I think surrounding yourself with the right people is no matter whether you're battling cancer or not, is so key,
So
right? Because if
important.
you're around somebody that's negative all the time or always has
Yep.
problems or all that, that affects you personally as
Yeah.
well. Like, some people might not realize it, and sometimes you can't help those people. The only people that can help them
Is
is
them.
themselves.
Yeah.
It's like I've gone through that in some relationships before, where it's just like, you're always trying to be there, you're always trying to help, and I think taking care of yourself is, you'll be
Yeah.
more likely to take care of others at that point.
Absolutely true. Yeah.
So yeah, no, that's great. I really appreciate you sharing that and spending the time with us today. This has been awesome having you on. If you're ever in Colorado, I definitely want to have you come into the studio
That would be
so we
great.
don't drop the call.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'd love to spend some more time with you eventually. If you got a little bit more time, I got a few more questions, and I'm in
Sure.
no hurry.
Yeah, I have maybe 10 more minutes.
Okay, cool,
Is that
perfect.
cool?
That's
Okay,
perfect. Yeah,
great.
I guess just published the book. It just came out this month, right? It's
Yeah,
available now, isn't it?
yeah, available now
And I
everywhere.
feel honored I got a copy before anybody else. Well, most people. Um, so thank you for sending that, and thanks for reaching out to us, because you're the perfect guest for the show. So
Oh, thanks.
I really have enjoyed having you on. What do you have coming up next? I know you're dealing with a lot right now. You've summited all
Yeah,
these mountains, the hardest mountains in the world or on our
yep.
planet that we know of at this point. What's kind of next for Lisa? I know that you're involved with helping others a lot, and
Yep.
just kind of wanted to get that story.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked. So I just in November returned from Nepal, climbing with a group of women. And so this whole idea came from some other female climbing friends who, we were sort of hanging out one night and we're like, we should just create an all women's climbing group. And so that grew, right, and I'm like, I'm good at executing. If you give me an idea, like, I'm not gonna let go of it. I'm gonna like run it to the end. And so a core group of us just continue to work on that and think about what that would be like. And it was really important for us that if we said all women, we really wanted it to be all women. And we wanted like the porters who help us carry gear to base camp to be women. We wanted the team that cooks and takes care of us at base camp to be all women. We wanted we wanted the rope fixing, all that stuff to be done by women. And so I reached out to an amazing Sherpani, so female Sherpa, who's incredible, has, amazing experience in the mountains, Pasang Lamu Akita Sherpa. Hardly knew her. On Instagram, I was like, hey, I'm, putting together this all women's climb. Do you want to be our Sirdar? Sirdar is the title for the lead Sherpa. And she was like, yes. Like, no questions, no like, what mountain are you going to climb?
Amazing.
Just like, yes. And so she helped us put together a group of local Nepalese women who rounded out our team. And then there were two climbers from the US, two climbers from Nepal, all, very experienced women. and we climbed a 20,000-foot mountain in Nepal called Cholatsi this fall. And we raised money to support women's education. So there are, sadly certain parts of Nepal where girls are often trafficked, and education is the way to prevent that from happening. And so we raised money for 18 girls to go to high school for 4 years, which was just a really rewarding experience. And we also, the women who Pasong hired to be on our team aspired to learn more about working in the mountains. So maybe their husband had been a porter and he became ill and she had to become the breadwinner, or children had died. Just really heartbreaking stories. And so we wanted to give them this opportunity to climb and to learn how to work in the mountains and to add that skill to what they could do. And so it was a sort of twofold, like helping women, who were in the adult part of their life, and helping women who were still growing and in school. And it was just super full circle, very rewarding climb. And that is something that I will do more of, because it really just changed the whole vibe of climbing, to be doing it to support someone else, and to be doing it to help, other people learn.
That's amazing. Are you guys doing anything with rock climbing at that point? Like, vertical
So
type
I'm not
stuff?
the most solid rock climber. Like, I like it, but it's not my jam. So this was there was some technical rock that we had to climb through, but most of that mountain was glacier,
It's
which was
really
wonderful.
interesting because are you familiar with Chelsea Rude? She was an Olympic rock climber. We've had
No.
her on the podcast too, and
Cool.
she started a very similar nonprofit, and I think it's called She Sins,
Awesome.
something
I'll
like
have to
that,
check it
or
out.
like a Sins, and it's
Yeah.
all based around rock climbing though. So we
Nice.
should connect you two guys, or
Yes,
you
I
two
would I would
ladies,
love that.
and it's an all women's group. It's all women belayers. The whole
Yep.
thing is ran and organized by women, and maybe you can help each other out and
I would love that
cross training or
connection.
something. And
And
she's here
even
in
just
Colorado.
figuring out how to make it work. Like, it was
Sure.
all new for us to like we ended up not creating a nonprofit. We worked through another one, but like there's a lot to figure out when you start doing those sort of fundraising climbs. So yeah, I
Sure.
love the
Yeah,
connection.
she's an incredible person. I'll try to connect you guys
Sweet.
after we're done recording here. If a woman wanted to get involved, she's inspired and has heard some of these stories, or maybe she doesn't have the means to climb or something like that.
Yeah.
What's
Yeah.
the best way to contact you or reach out to this group of women to get involved and that sort of thing?
Yeah, yeah. Please reach out to me. So I'm happy to like. I love hearing stories about all kinds of people who are wanting to climb in the mountains, or curious, or have questions. So you can reach me through my website, which is lisaclimbs.com. I have the same Instagram handle as well. And then my company, which I coach mountaineers through, is called Alpine Athletics, and that's alpineathletics.net online.
Perfect. Well, Lisa, thank you so much again for your time. It's been an honor to have you on. I'm really inspired by what you've accomplished, and I'm sure that many more people are. So thank you. I've really enjoyed this, and you're welcome back anytime. So
Awesome.
let's do it again virtually,
Yes.
or in person would even be better if I'm in the Seattle area. I got a long list of people to hang out with, so maybe we could do it all
Cool.
together or something.
Yeah,
But
add me to the list. That would be
yeah,
great. And I will, this was super fun for me. Your questions were great. I love digging into
uh,
like more of like what it's like to climb. So thanks for that. And thanks for having me. It was really fun.
no, thank you. It's just a conversation. We don't script anything, so it's just two people hanging out, and I
Perfect.
found that that's the best way. And I've really
Yep.
enjoyed hanging out with you today. I try not to interview anybody, but so it's just my own greed and stuff that I genuinely want to know. So
Awesome. Well, it worked
it's
out well.
it's
Thank
pretty
you.
selfish. So hopefully the listeners got something out of it.
I'm sure.
But thank you everybody for listening. We'll catch you on the next one. Lisa, one more time before we jump off, your website, Instagram, go follow Lisa. Where can they get the book? Is it available in bookstores? This is a
Yeah.
must read from the mountainside. I've really enjoyed it. I'm probably 3/4 of the way through it, and I'm not going to stop reading it. So
So, so yeah, the book is Finding Elevation, and you can order it on
it's right
Amazon,
here.
Barnes and Noble, get it from your favorite independent bookstore, or you can go to my website, Lisa Climbs, and order as well.
Perfect. And will you sign this copy for me when
I would love
I got a
to.
bunch of signed books here in the studio, but I need to add
Yes,
it to my collection.
coordinate
So,
that.
okay,
Yeah,
I
I'd
might
be
have to
happy
send it
to.
back to you, or we'll see you in person.
Perfect.
All right. Thanks again, Lisa. I
Thanks,
really
Bobby.
enjoyed this. Have a good day.
You too.
Thanks for listening to the Mountainside Podcast. If you haven't had a chance to do this already, please take a moment, follow, like, subscribe, or rate on whatever platform you catch the Mountainside Podcast at. Also, if you'd like some more information on upcoming episodes, safety tips, access to all of our affiliates, and all the badass discounts that we get here at the Mountainside Podcast, check out themountainsidepodcast.com.